Today we're sewing a cute summer top with ruffles along the bottom as well as the armholes and a tie closure in the back. This pattern is New Look 6732 and I'll be sewing view B. The material that I'm using in this video is a lightweight linen from the Linen Lab. I love all the little gathering details in this pattern, and I especially love the binding around the armholes on the inside for a nice, clean, professional finish. I think you'll love making this pattern too. Let's get started. Here is my front bodice piece, and we're going to gather the top edges before applying the yokes. Using the longest stitch on your machine and leaving thread tails on both ends, we're going to stitch from notch to notch along both top edges. Now we'll place our yoke pieces right sides together with the area that we just basted and pin on both sides. Then we can pull the basting stitches so that the top of the front piece matches the length of the yoke. Distribute the gathers evenly and pin in place. Sew these seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, finish the raw edges, and press the seams toward the yokes. Fold each of your ties in half right sides together, give them a good press. And then sew each of the long raw edges with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Turn each strap right side out. Then at one raw edge of the tie, tuck the raw edge to the inside so that you have a clean finish and you can slip stitch in place. Doing this for one short end of each tie. Here is the right side of my back piece, and we're going to baste the ties in place on either side of the top of the back V, placing the raw unsewn edges over the dot and pinning in place. And baste within the seam allowance. Then I'll place my front and back pieces right sides together along the shoulder seams and pin in place. I'm going to sew the shoulder seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, finish the raw edges separately, and press them open. I've gone ahead and applied interfacing to the wrong sides of both of my facing pieces. Now I'll place them right sides together and pin the shoulder seams. Sew the shoulders at a 5/8 inch seam allowance and press the seams open. For the outer edges of the facing, I've chosen to finish those raw edges using my serger. Then I'll fold those raw edges to the wrong side all the way around by a 1/4 inch. And once that's pressed, I'll top stitch close to my finishing stitches all the way around to finish the edges of the facing. And also, before you move forward, make sure you've transferred your stitching lines to the bottom of the V for the facing. Here are my back, yoke, and front pieces opened out away from each other with the right side facing me. Place your finished facing right sides together with the neck hole and pin in place along the interior edges, matching your shoulder seams. Sew around the neckline with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, and when you get to the bottom of the back V, you're going to stitch along the stitching line transferred from your pattern piece. To reinforce the stitching at the bottom of the V, take it back to your sewing machine and sew along the stitching line transferred from the pattern piece over your original stitches. Then, using a pair of sharp scissors, we're going to snip from the raw edge of the V to the point of the stitching line. Careful not to clip through the stitching. And now we can understitch the facing. We're going to turn the facing over its seam allowance and sew the facing to the seam allowance all the way around. As you're understitching around that V section, your presser foot won't allow you to understitch all the way to the bottom of the V, so understitch as far as you can, backstitch to secure, and start a fresh set of understitching on the opposite side of the V. Then turn your facing to the inside of the garment and give the neckline a good press. Now from the front of the garment, I'm also going to stitch in the ditch of each of my shoulder seams so that the facing stays nicely to the inside. Take your ruffle piece to the ironing board and fold the longer straight edge to the wrong side by 5/8 of an inch all the way across. Then take your raw edge and fold it to the crease you made with your iron, and then fold it on the crease to form a narrow hem and press that in place all the way across. And then top stitch that narrow hem in place close to the upper inner fold all the way across. Now that that's hemmed, we're going to gather the upper curved edge from one notch to the other, sewing basting stitches and leaving long threads at each end. Place your front and back pieces right sides together and pin the side seams. I'm going to sew these seams just as I did the shoulder seams, sewing at a 5/8 inch seam allowance and then finishing the edges of the seam allowance separately on both sides to press them open. Now we can attach the ruffles to the armholes. At the bottom corners of the ruffle, you have dots indicating where we're going to be placing these points at the underarm seam. Overlap those dots and pin them to the underarm seam, aligning the raw edges. Then match the dot at the top of your ruffle with the shoulder seam and pin in place. Right sides together. Pull your basting stitches to gather both sides of the ruffle, and once it's distributed evenly, pin in place. Baste the ruffle to the armhole all the way around and repeat to attach the ruffle to the opposite armhole. Now both of the ruffles are attached, and we can start finishing those seam allowances with our bias binding. We're using 1/2 inch wide single fold bias tape. Open out one of the flaps of the bias tape and fold back the short edge by about 1/4 of an inch. Place that folded back edge at one of the underarm seams so that the right side of the bias tape sits on the wrong side of the ruffle. And you want the crease of the bias tape to be 5/8 of an inch away from the raw edge of the ruffle. And continue pinning your bias tape like so all the way around the ruffle. Once the open end of the binding is back at the underarm seam, allow that edge to overlap the folded edge of the binding that you started with and pin in place. Allowing an overlap of about 1/2 of an inch and cutting off the excess. Then we'll sew that bias tape in place along the crease, all the way around. And trim the armhole and ruffle seam allowance all the way around to about 1/4 of an inch. Then we can take the loose folded edge of the bias tape and turn it to the inside of the garment over its seam allowance. Now we have a nice clean seam on the inside. And from the outside, we're going to top stitch in place, catching that inner folded edge of the bias tape as we go all the way around the armhole. And repeat to finish those seams for both armholes. Place your front and back bottom ruffles right sides together and pin the short edges. Sew those side seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, finish the raw edges separately and press the seams open. I've also gone ahead and prepared the narrow hem at the bottom edge of the ruffle, which we're doing in the same exact way as we hemmed the armhole ruffles earlier. First pressing the bottom raw edges to the wrong side by 5/8 of an inch, then pressing the raw edge once again to meet the crease, pressing it on the crease, then we're going to edge stitch close to that inner fold all the way around. Now we're going to sew basting stitches from one seam, leaving thread tails at the start, all the way to the other seam, stopping your stitches and leaving thread tails. Start a fresh set of basting stitches on the opposite side of the seam and continue stitching until you're back at the other side of the seam that you started your stitching at, once again leaving thread tails. Place the raw edge of the front and back ruffle along the bottom raw edge of their corresponding front and back piece and pin in place at the side seams. Pull your basting stitches so that the ruffle fits the bottom of the garment. Distribute the gathers evenly, match the notches, and pin in place. And repeat along the entire bottom edge of the bodice, gathering both ruffle panels. Then we can sew the bottom ruffle in place all the way around with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, finish the raw edges, and press the seam up toward the bodice. And now your blouse is complete. Thank you for watching this sew along. Make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss notifications every time a new sewing tutorial comes out, and I'll see you in the next video.